everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about assessing behavior. The main reason why we assess behavior is to figure out the function of the behavior or why the behavior is occurring. And so I like this little meme. It says, it's all fun and games until someone figures out the function of your behavior. So assessing behavior allows us to figure out the function and therefore implement an intervention that's going to have the most likely success of being effective. So for this video, our objectives are on the left, and our agenda, we're going to briefly talk about function-based assessments, the ABCs of behavior, the functions of behavior, the ABC analysis, how to do it, how to interpret it, and then we're going to briefly relate the ABC analysis to interventions. So let's get started with function-based assessments. So like I mentioned earlier, the purpose of the function-based assessment is to figure out the function of the behavior. So basically you are going to implement different strategies to figure out why the behavior is occurring. Like we talked about in the considering behavior video, if the behavior occurs once, not a big deal. But if the behavior is persisting or continuing to occur, then it's being reinforced somehow. There's a purpose to it. There's some maintaining consequence. The person is getting something that they want or avoiding something that they don't want. And so at the beginning, you might not know, I like this meme here, you might not know what the purpose is. But if the behavior is continuing to occur, then it's being reinforced somehow. It serves some purpose. And that's the whole key with your function-based assessments, to figure out what's the purpose of the behavior. And so we really want to understand the problem behavior better so that we can know what the kid wants and we can teach a better, more appropriate replacement behavior. So we still want the kid to get what he wants. We just want them to get it for an appropriate behavior as opposed to an inappropriate behavior. So like I just mentioned, if you guys hear function-based assessments, that means all the strategies that you use to determine the function of the behavior. And in behavior analysis, we have some main categories as to strategies to identify the function. At first, we start with what we call indirect assessments. So with these assessments, we're not going to actually go in and directly observe the behavior, but we're going to get information about the behavior through interviews with the caregiver, the teacher, rating scales, things like that. And with these categories, I like looking at them in terms of this pyramid. So indirect assessments, since you're not actually directly observing the behavior and you're getting your information about the behavior from other people, from the teachers and from other teachers and caregivers, it's really easy to do. So that's why it's at the bottom. Level of difficulty, it's not difficult at all. They fill out, you ask them questions, they fill out an assessment, things like that. But since you're not directly observing the behavior, you get the lowest level of precision in that you don't know that the person that you're interviewing is actually remembering the behavior correctly or remembering, what is going on correctly in the environment when the behavior is occurring. But indirect assessments do give you some really good information that you can base your next level on. So the next level up is what we call direct observations. And this is where you're going in there and actually directly observing the behavior. So when you directly observe the behavior, we do what we call an ABC analysis. So we go in there, we observe the behavior, and we observe what's going on in the environment right before the behavior occurs and right after the behavior. And so we basically observe our ABCs of behavior, and that's why it's called an ABC analysis. It's up here, one step above the indirect assessments on the pyramid, because it is a little more difficult and it requires more resources. So now it requires you to actually, instead of just giving somebody a form to fill out, it requires you to go in and actually observe behavior. But because you are going in there and actually observing, you get a higher level of precision, you get more accurate information, you get to see for yourself what's going on in the environment when the behavior occurs. So a much better assessment. If you still can't determine the function of the behavior or your data aren't consistent, then you might have to go to this final and third level, which we call an experimental analysis. And the specific technique here is a functional analysis. So in this category, you're actually directly, you're manipulating the environment and looking at the effects on the behavior. In these first two, you're not manipulating anything. So indirect, you're just doing interviews, rating scales. Direct, you're just observing. And so because of that, you can only hypothesize the function or predict the function with these two. But this one up here, that highest level, you are able to determine cause and effect or the function of the behavior because you are actually manipulating the environment. However, it's the most difficult one to do. It requires somebody needs to do it that has expertise to do a functional analysis. It requires the most resources, but like I said, you get the best data from it. So basically, if you would do an actual formal function-based assessment, which is required sometimes, especially for kids that get to that kind of tier 3 intervention, if you're going to do an actual formal function-based assessment, that would be the process that you would go through. However, if you guys remember in this class, we are focused on kind of just those tier 1, maybe those tier 2 interventions, and just classroom management in general. So for this class, we're just going to be focused on doing kind of a simple assessment, a really informal assessment with those direct observations. So when you guys are teaching in the classroom, first thing you would do is, if you have a kid that's engaging in the challenging behavior, you want to define that challenging behavior and measure it and make sure that it's something that you need to address. After that, you're going to start doing your function-based assessment, and you want to kind of figure out why the behavior is occurring, and that's going to be your ABC analysis. So with this video and in this chapter, we're just giving you guys a way to do a simple assessment and to do an ABC analysis in a really simple way that can help you guys determine the function and why the behavior is occurring. So with our ABC analysis, basically you are identifying your ABCs of behavior. So in your book refers to these as behavior chains. So you guys will hear me say ABCs of behavior or behavior chains. They mean the same thing. So like I mentioned, you guys will have the behavior, you're going to define it, and you're going to use those operational definitions. And here are some questions that just informally you can ask yourself to define the behavior and get your operational definition. So you can ask yourself, what does the behavior look like? Where does it occur? How often does it happen? How long before it happens? How intense it is? How long does it last? How fast does it go? Remember, when we create a definition of our behavior, when we operationally define it, we're defining it in a way that we can measure it. So we want to make sure we use our observable terms, our measurable terms, our positive terms, and that we are clear, concise, and complete. So when you go in and observe and do an ABC analysis, you're going to write down when the behavior occurs, these things, your behavioral definition, and then also what happens right before the behavior occurs in the environment. And these are what we refer to as the predictors of behavior. And these are the questions that you're going to ask yourself. When and where does the behavior happen? What day does it happen on? Are peers around? Are adults around? Is it when the kid is engaged in academic tasks or free time? Is it in group instruction, individual instruction? Is it in the classroom? Is it in the lunchroom? What makes the behavior happen? What triggers it? Did the teacher ask the kid a question? Were peers not looking at the learner? Was the teacher not looking at the learner? So, you're looking at kind of where the behavior occurs and what is actually triggering the behavior. And within your questions, we typically find that we go from really general to more specific, till you get really specific. You want to get as specific as possible, but you'll kind of start general. So you might say something like, when does the behavior occur? Does it occur in the morning or the afternoon? Okay, the morning. All right, when during the morning does it occur? Does it occur when he's on the bus in first period, second period, third period, fourth period? Okay, it occurs down first period. Okay, when in first period does it occur? When he enters the classroom during group instruction. All right, when he enters the classroom. Okay, what's going on when he enters the classroom? Are his peers there? Is he talking to a peer typically, and the teacher asks him to go sit down? So you go from really general to as specific as you can get. After you are kind of evaluating and analyzing the predictors of the behavior, then you want to go and look at the purpose of the behavior, and that's going to be your consequence, or what happens in the environment after the behavior occurs. And so to figure that out, you can kind of ask yourself these informal questions. Do you provide attention? Does the student avoid his work? Do the peers ignore the behavior? Does the student get something fun? And you're just going to describe what's going on in the environment after the behavior occurs. And so these are the data that you guys are going to take when you do kind of an informal ABC analysis. And you're going to write down, each time the behavior occurs, you're going to write down, what's going on in the environment before the behavior occurs and what's going on in the environment after the behavior occurs. And what happens is you're going to get these behavior chains, and you can look at your behavior chains and you can figure out from these data, and we're going to talk about some patterns and what to look for, what the function of the behavior occurs. So why is the behavior occurring? So these data, the data from your behavior chains or your ABCs of behavior, are going to tell you the function or why the behavior is occurring. And remember from our considering behavior video, we have basically 2 function types, and then your book divides them into 3 different kind of subcategories. So remember your 2 function types. Kids engage in behaviors typically to get access to something that they want or avoid something that they don't want. So with the tangible, they can engage in the behavior to get access to food or an iPad or a computer, some type of possession that they want. Or they can engage in a behavior to not have to eat a specific food or not play with a specific computer program or something like that. They can engage in behavior to get access to attention from a peer, an adult, a paraprofessional, anything like that. Or they can engage in behavior to escape attention from their teacher or a peer. They can engage in the behavior to get access to a specific activity that provides them maybe with some stimulation. So maybe the work that they're doing is too easy. They engage in the behavior and they get to do an activity that's harder and more challenging. Or maybe the work is too hard and they engage in the behavior to escape doing it because it's too challenging for them. So these are kind of your functions. And when you guys go in and do those simple observations, do your kind of informal ABC analysis and get your data on your behavior chains, you're going to be able to look at your behavior chains and hypothesize or predict one of these functions. So here's an example of ABC data, and you guys can see for here's the date, here's the time, here's the antecedent. So the teacher announces it's time for reading, and after that, the student tells an inappropriate joke, and the consequence is that his peers laugh and the class is disrupted. So you guys can see we're describing what's going on before the behavior occurs, the behavior, and what's going on afterwards. And so you guys can see those questions kind of come into play. What's going on before? Who's present? The teacher is present. Does she provide an instruction? Yeah, she says it's time for reading. After the behavior occurs, what happens? Does a peer give attention? Yeah, the peers laugh. The class is disrupted. Things like that. So you're going to use those questions that we talked about in the previous slide to kind of hone in on what's going on in the environment before and after the behavior occurs. And then you'll use those behavioral definitions, those operational definitions, to write over here what behavior the kid is actually engaging in. And I want to make a point that to actually figure out the function of the behavior, you have to see a pattern within your behavior chains. So get your ABCs of data, ABCs, and you're going to write them down. And once you get enough of them, you can go back and analyze them, and you're looking for patterns. So just one instance of ABC data or one behavior chain is not going to be sufficient to tell you the function of the behavior. You're going to record several different behavior chains so that you can analyze them and pick out the patterns within them, and that's going to give you the function of the behavior. Okay, whenever you guys are analyzing, so you have a couple different behavior chains and you're going to analyze them to figure out the function, you want to ask yourself a couple different questions. So these first 3 deal with the antecedent. So you want to look at, is the behavior occurring in the context of the same activity, materials, and structure, group of peers? Is it happening in the same teacher's classroom? Is it happening when the same instruction is being provided? So you're looking at those antecedents is there any pattern, is there any antecedent that you consistently see that will trigger the challenging behavior? And then following the instances of behavior, sorry guys, these last 4 questions, is there a consistent consequence that is used by the teacher, peers, or other adults? So does the teacher repeatedly provide attention to the kid or come and address the kid? Does the kid repeatedly get to go to the office after he engages in the problem behavior, and things like that? And so you can actually quantify these and get a percentage of how likely or how many times antecedents that you see reoccurring actually occur in your data. And that can give you a way to kind of quantify your data and really figure out what's your typical antecedent and what's your typical consequence. You can look at that and you can hypothesize a function of the behavior. So when you analyze, you get your, several behavior chains, look at your patterns, put a percentage to your antecedents and your consequences, and hopefully you'll see a clear pattern and you'll have a clear antecedent and consequence that has a high percentage of occurring, and that will tell you the trigger and the purpose or the consequence of the behavior. Okay, just a couple of things about kind of each of the functions. If the function is some type of attention, then, so the kid is engaging the behavior to gain access to attention, then typically what we see, and this slide only talks kind of about the consequences, but I also wanted to bring in information about the antecedents because those are important as well. If the consequence involves another person, then that's typically an indication that the function is attention. Also, if you notice with the antecedents that if an antecedent has something to do with a teacher helping other kids or not providing any type of attention to the kid, then that's also a sign that the function is attention. So you want to look for, in your antecedents, is he not getting attention? And then he engages in the behavior, and then he gets attention from another person. So if the consequence involves another person, you would look at maybe a function of attention. With escape, you're looking at, does the behavior allow him to get out of a demand, or out of an area of the class, or away from students, or things like that. So you want to look at your antecedents. If the teacher presents a demand to sit down or do math problems or something like that, and they engage in the behavior and they get sent to the office, or they go sit in timeout, something like that, then you have a demand that's being placed on them. They engage in the behavior. They don't have to do the demand. So that's kind of what you're looking for with regards to the escape function. Or you may have a peer that comes into the kid's space. They push the peer and they go sit in timeout. That might be an escape function. The consequence doesn't involve another person. This consequence involves escaping from that student. But you can see from the antecedents that maybe a particular student comes into the learner space, engages in the behavior, and he gets to go to timeout. So he gets to escape from that student. A function that your book doesn't address, but we typically do in behavior analysis, is what we call sensory. So sensory is the idea that the behavior within itself is reinforcing. So the behavior produces some type of internal sensation that's pleasant, or it removes some type of internal sensation that's aversive. And oftentimes we call these self-stimulatory behaviors. And so if you guys don't see a specific pattern, then it's possible that the function is sensory, and that it doesn't matter what the consequence is with regarding the environment. The kid is engaging the behavior because the behavior within itself is reinforcing. So if you guys look through this, a lot of times there is a clear pattern, and you can tell the function. But if if there's no clear pattern, then it's possible that it might be sensory. And then the other one I wanted to address is access to tangibles. So if you see that after the target behavior, the kid gets to go and do a preferred activity, or gets computer time, or gets an iPad or a food item or something like that, then that would be an instance of the tangible function. And the antecedent to that is that maybe they're playing with the tangible item and the teacher takes it away. Well, now it's removed, they engage in the problem behavior, and they get it back again. So maybe you have a kid who's on the computer playing games. The teacher tells him to turn off the game and go do math problems. Well, the teacher is essentially kind of taking that tangible away from them, so they engage in the problem behavior, and the teacher says, okay, 5 more minutes on the computer. And so they got access back after engaging in the challenging behavior. So that's what you're looking for within your patterns. And you're looking at those antecedents, seeing if there's a pattern in your antecedents, there's a pattern in your consequences, and then you're going to analyze those patterns and figure out what is the function of the behavior. And you're going to, like I said at the beginning, this is going to be a hypothesis or prediction. You're not actually manipulating anything in the environment, so you can't actually say for certain that this is the function of behavior, but you can hypothesize or predict from doing this kind of informal ABC assessment. Okay, so let's go back to our example. We have all of our ABC data, so all of our behavior chains. So now let's look back and try to analyze it, look at patterns, and figure out what we think the function is. So how you would do this is you would go through each of your behavior chains and try to hypothesize what you think the function is. So for our first one, we have the teacher announces that it's time for reading. So here I see that the teacher is placing a demand on the kid. It's time for us to read now. Kid engaged in the behavior, and peers laugh, and the class is disrupted. So when I look at the consequence, so we do have a demand, but our consequence involves other people, so peers, and also him getting out of the task, because now the class is disrupted. So I would say that possible function could be escape or could be attention. One thing you guys have to realize is that a function, the same behavior can serve 2 functions, and yeah, the same behavior can have multiple functions, and 2 behaviors can serve the same function, so just kind of keep that in mind. But a behavior can serve multiple functions. And this goes to show you guys that just one instance, if it was just this, we couldn't really tell if it was actually escape or attention from this instance. So that's why we take data on several instances, so you should have several behavioral chains that you pick out the pattern. Okay, let's go to the next one. So teacher calls on George to read first. He throws his book and gets sent to the office. So teacher calls on George. Here's another demand. George throws his book and he doesn't have to read. So I would say the possible function of that one would be escape. And now we have that the teacher asked George to pay attention. So once again, another demand. The teacher is providing him with attention. She's giving a demand. George crouches down so he can't see, and nobody says anything, teacher doesn't say anything, and George just continues down there. He can't see the instruction, so he's not paying attention. And so I would say that's an example of escape, especially if you look at your antecedent. So the teacher is providing attention, so the kid doesn't need to engage in the behavior to get attention. If the teacher had started working with another kid and then George crouched down, then that might be indicative of attention. But right now she's giving attention, but she placed a demand. He engaged in the behavior. He doesn't have to follow through with the demand. He doesn't have to read. He doesn't have to pay attention. Here, teacher instructs class to move into reading groups. So once again, another instruction. George sighs, puts his head on his desk, and nobody says anything. George continues to do it, and he doesn't join his group. So you guys can think about it. I would say that's escape. So at this consequence, nobody provides him with attention. Nothing's written in the environment about peers addressing him or anything like that. He just doesn't join his group and doesn't read. So let's see. This next one. Teacher asks George to move to his reading group. George slams his book shut, and the teacher warns him not to throw his book. And there's no other information. So this one's, I think, a little hard, and that's why it's important to write as much information as possible and to be as detailed as possible. So we have a teacher asked George to move to his reading group. So we do have a demand there. So it's possible that it's escape. And then the consequence does provide attention from the teacher. So she warns him not to throw his book, but it doesn't say what else he does. So it looks like he doesn't actually move to his reading group. And so here, I think I classified this more as attention, but also we don't know if he moved to the reading group or not. So attention or escape and attention. And then last one, teacher says, go to your group. George throws his book and walks out of the class towards the principal's office. Consequence, teacher, it looks like she continues to have class, and he walks to the principal's office, so he avoids reading. And we would say that that would be escape. So we've taken our data on our behavioral chains, and we've gone through and we've analyzed them, and each one we've identified a possible function by looking at our antecedents and our consequences. And so now you can kind of quantify this with percentages. So we can look at, we had 6 instances, and 5 of them included escape. And if you guys ended up putting escape here, you might have 6 out of 6, so you might have 100%. And then we can look at our other possible function was attention. We said attention could be the possible function in 2 out of 6, so 33%. And so we can look and we can say, okay, 83% of the time we think it was escape, 33% of the time we think it was attention. And so we would probably hypothesize or conclude that the overall function of behavior is escape. So he's getting to escape doing his work or following through with the teacher demand, whatever it is, reading or going to his group. And one thing I wanted to point out, when you guys do this, is to let your data be your guide. So a lot of times when you start doing your ABC data and you start recording what's going on in the environment before the behavior occurs and after, I would really urge you guys just to focus on that. So at that moment when you're recording your behavior chains and your ABC data, I don't think about trying to interpret the data or why it's happening. Just focus on what's going on in the environment. And then once you guys get enough behavior chains, you can go back and start interpreting it and start figuring it out. But I feel like a lot of times people try to write down what's going on and also try and interpret it at the same time, and it just kind of gets a little confusing. So keep it simple, keep it clear cut. Don't think about why it's happening. Just write down what's going on in the environment. Get some really good data on your behavior chains, and that will help with your with you actually analyzing the data and trying to figure out the function. Here's another example of ABC data. So there's 6 instances here, 6 behavior chains. You got antecedents, behavior, the consequences. And so basically with this one, you guys can go through it, but the first time the parent asks Joe to stop playing on the computer, Joe screams no and refuses to leave the computer. The parents tell Joe to leave the computer again. So I would say for this one, you do have a tangible item right here, and the parents are providing attention at the very beginning, or are providing attention to the kid. So he doesn't need to engage in the problem to get attention. But you do have attention, and you do have another person present with regards to the consequence. And the parent is continuing to tell Joe to leave the computer. So, I would say for this one, probably more so tangible, because the tangible item is present at the beginning with the antecedent, and he's getting attention, so he doesn't need to engage in behavior to get attention. But it's possible, since we do have that parent and the consequence continuing to talk to him, that it is attention. So I would say more likely tangible, but also possibly attention. So we look through here. The parent tells Joe to leave the computer. Joe refuses to leave. So the parent starts counting to 10 as a warning to get off the computer. Once again here, you do have another person here, so possibly attention. But once again, he has attention from in the antecedent, he has attention. And the issue is that he doesn't want to leave the computer. He refuses to leave, and the parent starts counting. Cool. He's still getting access to the computer with his behavior. So I would say it's starting to look more and more like the tangible. Parent starts counting to 10 as a warning to get off the computer. Joe doesn't move from the computer station. The parent finishes counting to 10 and warns him to get off the computer again. So he's still not, the parent wants to get him away from the computer. He's engaged in behavior, and he's still getting access to the computer. So you guys can go through, at the very end, you get the parent counts to 10 again. Joe ignores, continues to use it. The parent becomes angry and leaves the room. So in this instance, parent's really not giving him attention, gets angry and leaves, and he continues to get access to the computer. So I would say this would be a really good example of a tangible function. Okay, one thing that I wanted to wrap up with is what we call setting events. So these are events that change the strength of stimuli and responses in that behavioral chain or in that ABC relationship. But setting events are typically temporally distant. So when you're looking at antecedents, those are things that occur in the environment right before the behavior occurs. Setting events can occur earlier that day, the night before, things like that. And so setting events are sometimes really helpful when you have behaviors that, like it says on site, kind of happen out of the blue or you can't really pinpoint a clear antecedent. And so basically, when we talk about setting events, these are events that make the antecedent more likely to trigger the behavior. So that's how I like to think about them and I like to conceptualize them. So let me give you guys some examples of setting events. This would be something like the kid, like we have on the slide. So right here, the antecedent is Sarah playing on the computer. The teacher gives instructions. She screams no. The teacher says, you need to come sit at your desk and return to the front of the classroom, and Sarah just keeps playing. Well, it's possible that Sarah did not follow the teacher's instruction and scream no because something earlier happened and that she didn't eat snack at recess. So since she didn't eat snack, she's probably hungry and irritated, and therefore this antecedent, so the teacher giving the instruction, it's more likely to trigger the behavior. Maybe if she would have eaten lunch and she would have been full and not irritated, then Sarah would have gotten off the computer when the teacher asked her. But she's hungry, she's irritated, and therefore it makes the antecedent more likely to trigger the behavior. If you have kids that are in a bad mood that day, you come in and you can completely see that they're not in a good mood. Well, it's more likely that your instruction or whatever antecedent typically is predictive of triggering the problem behavior is going to be more likely to trigger that problem behavior. Maybe the kid just got in a fight with his or her best friend before they came into your class. Well, now they've come to your class and they're irritated and they're in a bad mood, and therefore the antecedent is going to be more likely to trigger the problem behavior. Maybe they didn't get enough sleep the night before. Maybe they didn't take their medication. All those things are events that we call setting events that are temporally distant from the antecedent in your behavioral chain, but make the antecedent more likely to trigger the challenging behavior. And I want to wrap it up with talking about the fact that, like I mentioned at the beginning, we go through our function-based assessments to find the function of the behavior. After we identify the function, that allows us to implement an intervention that gives us the most likely chance that the intervention is going to be successful. We have different interventions that target different functions, and if we just don't do a function-based assessment and just implement a random intervention, then we might get lucky. It might address the function, but it might not. So that's why we go through these function-based assessments. We spend a lot of time looking at the function because that cuts down overall our resources that we put into interventions. If we can identify an intervention that we know has the most probability of being successful, then that's what we want to start with. And it helps you as a teacher. It doesn't drain all your resources. You don't drain all your resources on an intervention that you don't even know will be successful. these interventions that are based on the function have been shown in the literature, they're research-based, to address those specific functions. And so it sets the kid up for success, it helps you, it's not as stressful, and it's just all around just more effective and more efficient. So this is kind of our last chapter on assessing behavior. And after that, we are going to be focusing on kind of things that you guys can do to prevent a problem behavior and how you would address a challenging behavior dependent on the function. What are some simple interventions that you guys can use depending upon the function of a behavior? And remember with this class, like I did mention earlier, we're focused more, so we do use those multi-tiered systems of support. And we have our Tier 1, which gets the majority of kids, or basically all the kids, or sorry, 80% of students. Tier 2, which gets kind of those small groups. And then Tier 3, which is that highest level, that really intensive intervention. And so your kids that are in Tier 3 are going to actually go through that whole formal process of doing the function-based assessments. But for this class, we're starting at kind of Tier 1, and you're going to be adjusting kind of the whole class, and you might see problem behaviors from one kid, and you can do your kind of formal ABC analysis, and that might give you an idea of an intervention that you can do at the Tier 2 level. And so that's kind of what we're getting at in this class, especially with your classroom management project. So, all right, guys, we talked about function-based assessments. Remember, those are all the strategies that you guys use to determine the function of behavior. And in this class, we specifically just talked about the strategy of doing an ABC analysis. We talked about ABCs of behavior, or our behavior chains. Talked about the functions of behavior, reviewed those. We talked about an ABC analysis, so how to write down your ABCs of behavior, how to look at them, how to analyze them, analyze your antecedents and consequences. Remember, you're looking for patterns, and you can also put a percentage and kind of quantify it that way. And then we briefly talked about how those ABC analyses relate to the interventions that you guys will select to implement. So, all right, guys, thank you so much for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.